So, after the government in San Francisco imposes a price ceiling, we see an even more severe shortage in the market. So, when there are not sufficient resources efficiently being allocated to society, then society overall will be worse off. So, why is that the case? And how can we show the welfare impacts of a price ceiling on rent through an economic diagram? So first, let's do a comparison in welfare analysis before the price ceiling and after that pricing was imposed. So initially, in a competitive free market where supply meets my demand, where marginal cost meets marginal benefit at this equilibrium happy state. So previously, you have learned about consumer surplus and producer surplus, right? So let's together review that one more time. So consumer surplus is represented by this triangle here. It is the price that consumers, or tenants in this case, are willing to pay for their apartments, less the price that they actually pay for that apartment. So, for example, a tenant is willing to pay, for instance, $2,000 per month for one single apartment in San Francisco, and that's actually quite high. But he actually only ended up paying $900 for that apartment, and that $900 is the final market price, right, in this free market. So in this case, he'll be very happy because in a sense he can use that surplus. So $2,000 minus $900, and that's in total $1,100 to do something else. So he could perhaps go out for dinner with his friends or buy a gym membership, so on and so forth. But certainly everyone's willingness to pay is very different, right? So for me, I am a poor college student, so I'm only willing to pay, for example, 1,500 for a month. Anything exceeds that amount will be way too expensive for me. But if the actual rent is 900, that would be a very good news to me because I still have a surplus. But this surplus will be smaller than the other tenants that we discussed. So for me, the surplus is 600. And how do I get that? Is 1,500 minus 900. Right? And I get $600 in total for my surplus. So if we find all of the individual on this part of the demand curve and calculate their surplus and add them up together, we'll have our total consumer surplus in this market. So you might feel a little bit confused. So how about the consumers at this region? We don't actually include them because, as you can see, their willingness to pay is lower than the actual price here. So therefore, they don't really get a positive surplus. Or perhaps, in other words, their willingness to pay is below equilibrium level, and that's way too low. So surplus doesn't even exist for them, unfortunately. And if you understand the concept of consumer surplus real well, you'll be able to understand producer surplus in only 1 millisecond. Okay, so trust me, it's really easy. So it is the difference between producers' willingness to supply in terms of price and the actual price they get. So, for instance, if I'm the landlord, initially I was prepared to rent out my apartment with this price of $500 per month, and that's a little bit too low. But I ended up renting it out with this market price of $900 per month. And as this price increases, if I'm the supplier, of course I'm happy. So in this case, I earn $400 extra than I was originally expected. And that $400 is my producer surplus. So there are many other landlords in this renting market, not just me, right? So as long as their willingness to supply is below this market level, they will earn a surplus. So when I calculate all of their surplus and add them up, this triangular area, as you can see here, would then be the total producer surplus. So the total welfare is just the sum of the consumer surplus and producer surplus adding up together. So at this free market equilibrium level, as you can see, society achieves its allocated efficiency. Right? So this occurs at MC intersects with NB, where supply meets demand. So now imagine the government in San Francisco imposes a rent control or a price ceiling. So the price level is going to go down to this level beneath the original equilibrium. So think about it. Is that going to affect like consumer surplus, producer surplus, and welfare? And the answer is definitely yes, right? So recall the definition for consumer surplus. It is the difference between their willingness to pay less the actual price level. So if actual price level has changed, of course these components of welfare in society will change as well, right? And when I find all the renters on the demand curve and sum up their surplus, and the total consumer surplus will be this trapezoid. So you might want to ask, how about this part of the consumers? It seems like their willingness to pay is also higher than the new price level under this price ceiling, right? But notice that if there is a ceiling, only quantity S is going to be produced. So we stop here, we have to stop here as we calculate the consumer surplus. So at any point that has the corresponding quantity over this amount does not count into our final calculation and analysis. So does the producer surplus. So we find all the producer points on the supply curve and calculate the total producer surplus. And as you can observe here, the triangle is way smaller than before. And now we want to see what is the total welfare after the price ceiling policy was imposed. So we sum them up and get this big trapezoid. So even though this area of trapezoid is very big, but what do you observe when we compare the current welfare to the previous welfare under the free market? We can see actually part of the area is lost, right? So we can see this small triangular area is the loss of my total welfare. And it also has a very pessimistic name, which is called dead weight loss, something that leaks out of the system and is not efficiently used by the society as a whole. So you'll see that for consumers, they lose this B part. But for them, this C area is the gain. But the gain in surplus is only for those who are willing to pay more, which is represented by this part on the demand curve. And unfortunately, those people who are less prosperous will have to lose their welfare, which is represented by area B. And this part of the producers will lose their welfare as well compared to the free market scenario. So overall, people who don't support the price ceiling would use this as their main argument. So even though this policy claims to do in favor for the renters, certainly not all the renters are going to receive the benefits. And the poor don't really get what they need. And only the more privileged people who are willing to pay more get this apartment that under rent control policy in San Francisco, right? So on the producer's side, there's only a loss, no gain at all for them. And this actually is a very strong evidence, right? So there's a resource misallocation in the society. Add on to that, if you have watched my previous video, we have already mentioned how landlords will have less incentive to invest in those rent control units and perhaps look for other investment opportunities, right? So therefore, the supply of housing will go down, shifting the entire supply curve to the left. And that will cause a huge problem since the shortage or gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded will be even wider, as you can see. So for people who are against price ceiling, it has a very strong argument here. So policies should be designed to improve the society that we live in, but we see from our welfare analysis, producers aren't very happy, and those who are poor and those who are from very low income households aren't very happy either. So what's the whole point of imposing this price ceiling or rent control? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next video. So please subscribe my channel and don't forget to leave a comment down below. And I'll see you next time. Ciao.